The first time they saw him play, it was under the harsh neon of a community hall, his mismatched pieces clicking on a folding board like they didn't belong there. The win came fast, too fast for a boy in sneakers and a secondhand hoodie, and the small crowd didn't know whether to clap or to question what they'd just seen. But that was later. Before the applause, before the whispers, there was a kitchen table scarred with burn marks, a board bought from a flea market, and a childhood lived on the thin edge between enough and not quite. He hadn't grown up surrounded by coaches or country clubs. His parents didn't forbid the game, but they didn't understand it either. To them, it was just something that kept him from wandering off. The neighborhood had no chess club, only a few retirees who played on cracked stone benches in the shade, their moves slower than their stories. He learned his first checkmate there, hunched over plastic pawns, then ran home to compare those positions to a battered tactics book with someone else's handwriting in the margins. His first serious win left him flushed, unsure whether he'd just stumbled into something or finally found the thing he'd been looking for. His first crushing loss, though, wasn't about the score. It was about not knowing why it happened. One afternoon, an old man leaned in after a match and told him, "You don't have to win today. Just learn why you lost." The words stuck like a pin in the fabric of his mind. From that day, he spent nights under a dim kitchen light, replaying every move until the board felt like a map of the world. By the time anyone outside his block noticed him, the promise had already been made. Not to the world, not to his parents, but to himself. One day, people would remember his name. Not because of where he came from, but because of the games they'd never forget. They still talk about that game. The one where the queen vanished from his side of the board in a single, shocking move, not blundered, but sacrificed. The spectators froze, the opponent's coach went pale, and a few whispered that the kid had finally cracked under pressure. But 10 moves later, the trap snapped shut, and the handshake at the end was slow, almost reluctant, like the opponent was still piecing together how it had happened. It wasn't an accident. Long before that day, his games had been a rebellion against the quiet perfection of textbook theory. While others studied classical openings the way monks study scripture, he prowled the sidelines of forgotten manuals and dusty databases, memorizing gambits and offbeat combinations like contraband. If orthodox chess was a cathedral, pillars of control, harmony, and symmetry, his was a street market, loud, unpredictable, full of sharp turns and hidden knives. He didn't play to impress the purists, he played to make them uncomfortable. Every move was a question mark hurled across the board, and if you couldn't answer fast enough, the game was already over. Coaches called it reckless. His friends called it chaos. He called it survival. And yet, the deeper his style carved itself into his identity, the more it set him apart from the polished prodigies around him. The wins were spectacular, but the risks were lethal. Somewhere in those victories, the seeds of his next chapter were already being planted, because chaos, no matter how beautiful, doesn't always survive the long game. The crowd didn't see the sleepless nights or the vending machine dinners. They saw a skinny teenager toppling the reigning national junior champion under blinding stage lights. The handshake was firm, but the silence in the hall spoke louder. A new contender had arrived. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled, and somewhere in the back, a coach muttered to another, "This one's different." But rewind a few hours, and the glamour fades. He'd landed on a budget flight at dawn, the kind where the air smelled faintly of instant noodles and tired ambition. His hotel was a cracked mirror room above a noisy street where the walls sweated in the summer heat. Dinner the night before had been a packet of instant ramen, eaten cross-legged on the bed while he rechecked his opponent's games on a flickering laptop. For most kids his age, tournaments were a weekend trip. For him, they were survival missions. Sleeping upright in airport lounges, wearing the same shirt 2 days straight, playing through headaches because the ticket had already been paid for and forfeiting wasn't an option. And yet, every time he sat at the board, the fatigue dissolved. The chess clock became a heartbeat, the squares a battlefield, and the only thing that mattered was the promise made years ago at a kitchen table with mismatched pieces. That win wasn't just a point on the scoreboard. It was proof that the climb was real. But in the shadows of that victory, another figure was already rising, one who would turn his greatest ambition into his greatest obstacle. The first time they met, it ended in silence. Not the stunned hush of a shocking blunder, but the slow, suffocating quiet that follows a checkmate everyone saw coming, everyone except him. His attack had been fierce, the kind that normally forced opponents into panic. But across the board, the golden boy sat unmoved, dismantling threats as if peeling away layers of paper, each move tightening the invisible net until escape was no longer possible. Only later would people realize how perfectly their styles clashed. The golden boy played like winter, slow, deliberate, inevitable. Every pawn push was a frost creeping across the board, freezing space until there was nowhere left to move. The kid from nowhere thrived on chaos, sharp lines, traps sprung in the dark, sacrifices that made crowds gasp. Against the Golden Boy, that chaos simply evaporated. That match had taken place under the bright chandeliers of a continental open, the air thick with tension and the faint scent of overbrewed coffee. By the time the handshake came, the scoreboard already told the story. But to the boy in the hoodie, the real weight was in the way his opponent didn't celebrate, as if victory was simply expected, a natural outcome. From that day forward, the Golden Boy wasn't just another name in the bracket. He was the storm on the horizon, the wall at the top of the climb, the fixed point every road seemed to lead toward. Training sessions became more intense, notebooks filled with counters to his favorite lines, midnight analysis sessions built around one goal: break the unbreakable. What he couldn't know was that this rivalry would grow into something larger than either of them. Not just a contest of moves, but a contest of futures. And in that contest, only one could own the board. By the time his face started showing up in memes and highlight reels, most people assumed the streaming thing had been part of the plan. It hadn't. It had started months earlier with a flickering borrowed webcam and a half-joking suggestion from a friend. Why not go live? Worst case, nobody watches. He did. And within hours, hundreds of usernames filled the chat. Not grandmasters, not theory junkies, but night owls, bored students, and curious rookies who barely knew the night moved in an L. The moment that truly detonated came 3 weeks later. 40 seconds of chaos, a queen sacrifice that looked suicidal until 3 moves later, the board flipped, and the opponent's king fell in checkmate. That clip, clipped by someone else and posted without context, pulled in over 1 million views in a week. Suddenly, chess was in timelines that had never cared for it. Traditionalists winced. In their world, chess was sacred, conducted in hushed rooms under the smell of old wood and old books. His broadcasts were noisy, messy. He laughed when he blundered, talked trash to chat mid-move, explained just enough to keep people watching without turning it into a lecture. To the purists, it was undisciplined. To everyone else, it was electric. The numbers spiked. Sub counts climbed. Within months, his stream wasn't just a side project. It was an arena. Fans didn't log in to study openings. They came to watch a street fight played on 64 squares. And slowly, without quite realizing it, he went from being the promising young player chasing titles to being the guy who made chess feel alive again. But every transformation has its price. And in the glow of those monitors, the first cracks in his competitive edge were beginning to show. It should have been routine, a mid-tier opponent in the early rounds of a major international. Instead, it became a 25-move collapse. To the crowd, it was just another upset. To those who knew him, it was unthinkable. The postmortem was merciless. He'd been ambushed in a well-known opening line, one any top player would have prepared for, except he hadn't. On the broadcast, a veteran grandmaster didn't bother softening the blow. "He's gifted," the commentator said, eyes fixed on the replay, "but the streaming is killing his edge." The clip spread faster than any of his recent highlights, not because it was wrong, but because it rang uncomfortably true. Before the cameras and overlays, his life had been measured in hours of silent, disciplined work. 6, sometimes 8 hours a day of opening prep, endgame drills, and cold calculation. Now, that time had been cut to less than half, the rest consumed by chat interactions, editing schedules, and the churn of content creation. He told himself the games played live were still training, but deep down, he knew better. A blitz match with a laughing audience wasn't the same as a deep dive into a sharp Sicilian line at midnight, with nothing but a notebook and a database. The noise was eating away at the edge, and the results on the tournament floor were starting to show it. Still, the lights stayed on, the stream schedule stayed full, and the wins, the real, slow, over-the-board wins, became rarer. Somewhere beyond the screen, the reigning king of the chess world was still studying, still refining, still waiting. And every day, the gap grew a little wider. By the time the resignation came, it was already obvious. The pieces sat frozen in positions that looked harmless to the untrained eye. But to anyone who understood, the game had been over for at least 10 moves. The king didn't win with fireworks. He won the way glaciers move, slow and silent, until the landscape itself is reshaped. It had begun as a calculated gamble. In the opening, the challenger had rolled out a razor-sharp Najdorf line, hoping to lure the king into chaos. Instead, the king sidestepped every snare, parrying aggression with quiet precision. On move 18, the attacker found his major pieces locked behind their own pawns. By move 23, a seemingly innocent exchange triggered a chain reaction. a passed pawn creeping up the queen's side like an unhurried executioner. Spectators leaned in, waiting for the counterattack that never came. The king's trademark was not brilliance but inevitability. No single blow, no grand sacrifice, just the gradual tightening of space until every square felt like a closing door. The clock ticked down, and the challenger, once the master of chaos, could only shuffle pieces in place, suffocating in slow motion. When the handshake finally came, there was no anger, only a hollow stillness. Months of preparation had shifted nothing. If anything, the gap felt wider. The king left the board without a smile, without a glance. Not out of arrogance, but because for him, this was just how the world worked. And somewhere beyond that hall, a younger generation was already studying, preparing to climb. Not toward him, but toward both of them. It happened in front of a live audience and a dozen cameras, a rising prodigy barely out of his teens, dismantling him in 30 moves. There was no drama, no wild swings, just a clean execution. Every reply he made felt as if it had been rehearsed by his opponent weeks ago, and perhaps it had. The kid had an entire team behind him, a personal coach, AI-assisted opening labs, endgame specialists, and a data analyst tracking every nuance of his play. It wasn't just one loss. It was the look afterward, the respectful handshake paired with eyes that said, "I'm coming for your place." Only later, away from the stage, did the full weight settle in. He'd once been the one with that stare, challenging the old guard, bringing chaos to their carefully built fortresses. Now the cycle had turned, and he was on the other side. The new generation didn't arrive raw and unpolished like he had. They came engineered for war, their training schedules carved down to the minute. Their preparation deepened by engines that never slept. The pride was real. Watching the game grow, seeing new talents light up the board, but so was the unease. Every tournament felt like walking a narrowing bridge, the footsteps behind him growing louder. The pressure wasn't just about winning anymore, it was about proving he still belonged in the conversation. And somewhere between that pride and that fear, the thought began to creep in. Maybe the legacy he'd leave wouldn't be about conquering the game, but about surviving long enough to pass the torch. It happened in the middle of the noise, a crowded exhibition hall, camera flashes bouncing off glass boards, and the hum of post-match chatter. A boy, maybe 12, stepped forward clutching a cheap plastic set. He spoke barely above a whisper. "I started playing because I saw your stream." For a moment, the rest of the room blurred. In that shy smile and awkward grip on the pieces, he saw himself. The kid at the kitchen table with mismatched pawns, dreaming of games that mattered. It wasn't the first time he'd heard it. Messages had poured in for years, emails, DMs, videos from strangers saying they'd learned or returned to chess because of him. But face to face, here was proof in the flesh. His influence wasn't measured in titles or rating points, but in the spark he'd lit in others. Compared to the legacy of a champion, trophies gleaming in glass cases, games immortalized in opening manuals, his own legacy was harder to frame. It lived not in archives but in memories, in late-night Twitch clips, in inside jokes from streams, in the moment someone saw a queen sacrifice and thought, "I want to try that." Some days, that thought felt warm, as if the years of sacrifice had been worth it. Other days, it sat heavier, because he'd never set out to be inspirational. He'd set out to be unbeatable. And somewhere between those two destinies, he realized, the road had split. What he didn't yet know was that the next game, and the next loss, would force him to decide which legacy mattered more. The lights were off, the crowd long gone, and the board sat empty. 64 squares holding nothing but echoes. He remembered something an old master once told him. Chess is the art of memory, but memory doesn't win you medals. In that stillness, the truth of it felt heavier than any trophy he'd ever chased. From the outside, it looked like he'd won everything worth winning. Millions of viewers, countless viral moments, a generation of new players who'd picked up the game because of him. But standing at the crossroads, the lines were clearer than ever. One path led to glory, the kind written in record books, measured in titles and flawless games that would be studied for decades. The other led to influence, the kind etched not in archives, but in the minds of those who saw him play and thought, "I want to try." You couldn't walk both paths forever, and that was the real cruelty. Not the losses, not the grind, but the trade-off. In this game, to hold one thing, you must let go of another. If someone just starting out were to ask him which to choose, he wouldn't give an answer. Instead, he'd pose a question. Would you rather win unseen or lose and be remembered by everyone? And maybe that's why it sucks, because the board never tells you which choice is right, only that the clock is always ticking.